Hello, Mr. Thompson.
Hi.
John Ebert again.
Okay.
Okay, are we all set?
Yeah.
Okay. By the way, I interviewed your Coming Into Being for Parabola, and I just want to say that I absolutely loved the book. I thought it was your best book. I basically said in the review that it was the summa of your writings, because I thought that you had taken up almost all the strands that I could think of from all of your books and woven them together into this. I sort of compared it with the Book of Kells, you know, the kind of the layered texturing in the Book of Kells with what you were doing in that. And I said it was just really consummate stuff. So they haven't written back to me to say what they thought of the review. Hopefully they'll want it. But
Okay. Yeah, I think there may be a competition for the review because my editor said he ran into some guy at the meeting of the American Academy of Religion who was on the board of Parabola, and he asked him about if what St. Martin's was coming out, and they said a new book by me, and he said he wanted to review it. that may be the only difficulty you might run into.
Oh, well.
But
if not, I'll send it somewhere else.
Why, maybe that'll solve the problem.
Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to start, if you don't mind, with your first book, The Imagination of an Insurrection. And it seems to be somewhat atypical of your writings in that it's more of a specialized account of a single historical event, the Easter Rebellion in Ireland in 1916. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about how that book evolved in your imagination and what impelled you to write it.
Well, I've always wanted to go to Ireland, so being American-Irish, I had, as many American-Irish have, a kind of desire for a fantasy landscape of returning to the old sod and finding a culture that had tradition and roots and something deeper than, you know, the highway strips of America when I was growing up in L.A. So Ireland, and especially the Irish writers like Yeats, were always sort of adolescent heroes of mine, and the Celtic spirit in general, Dylan Thomas and the Welsh. So when I was an undergraduate, I wrote a long honors thesis on a philosophy of history, much to the chagrin of all my professors who believed that you should do just a specialized thing on one poem or one writer or something. And I did a whole theory of cultural history and played my own Vico. And they didn't like that, and I had to fight them very hard to do it. I was majoring simultaneously in anthropology, philosophy, and English literature. And so the book represented my tying up together all the strands of my three different majors. And then when I went to graduate school, of course, it's even more intensely specialized at Cornell. And I became interested in A.E. and Yeats and the Easter Rebellion and their different poems on it, and wrote a term paper for Robert Martin Adams at Cornell on the Easter Rising, and then suggested that there was enough material there for a doctoral dissertation, and they said okay, though there was no one in Irish studies there because Adams was a Joyce scholar and just only Ulysses and not so much Ireland, but just Joyce. So I said, because I had already published a dissertation-length thesis as an undergraduate and had published already a couple of articles, that I wanted to skip the whole dissertation exercise and just simply write a book, and that if it were a scholarly book, you would drag out chapter 1 for 200 pages and lots of footnotes, and then as in your first year as a professor, you'd have to boil down that long 200-page into just one introductory chapter and then add on all the other stuff to make it a book. So I said, why don't we just skip this exercise and I'll just simply go to Dublin and write a book. And so I did that, and so it was always under the constraints of academe, which is nothing if not specialized. And I was interested in combining the sort of anthropological studies of a nativistic movement and historical studies, and then the literary studies of the Irish literary Renaissance, in ways that no scholar that I knew of combined or even knew those three areas of discourse. And I found a lot of resistance from academics who were specialists, and they have a visceral contempt and suspicion of big ideas.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, well, they're primarily postal clerks.
Sure.
They live in a bureaucracy, and they sort of, receive stamped opinion and pass it on, and
Sure.
that's their job. And so even when I was doing the book, the Irish historian at MIT, Emmett Larkin, really disliked my generalizations on imagination and history at the end, and he sort of said with scathing contempt, if I wanted open end, I would listen to David Susskind, a television talk show of the 60s. And I said, no way, I've done all the research to give myself license to make these generalizations about imagination and history. That's what I'm interested in. I'm going to put it in anyway. And he didn't really like that kind of thing because he was a historian of very detailed studies of the role of the church in 19th century Ireland. So academics basically just don't like that kind of thing.
No.
But Oxford Press liked the book and published it. So it was published as a University Press book. So it was not a trade book. It was published by Oxford University Press. So it's very much a work of history, not a work of trade, what would now be called, trade nonfiction. And that was, in the old days when I was a professor at MIT. So it's part of that, period of time of my life.
Yeah. In your next book, At the Edge of History, you talk about your disillusionment with the university. Can you discuss what the intellectual atmosphere was like at MIT in the late 60s?
Well, it was extremely polarized between World War II warriors who were believers in modernizing the world through American corporations and believed in high-tech solutions to all things, and were basically captured by the behavioral sciences and a kind of modernizing political science, people like Ithiel de Sola-Pool. And then the New Left, who were inspired by Marxism under the leadership of Noam Chomsky and the chair of the the literature division, Louis Kampf. And they basically were the mirror opposites of the technocrats. They were technologists. They believed in technological rationality, and they believed that philosophy and ideology were just simply the superstructure of the means of production, and that reality was economic and technological. So either way, you had a choice between materialism of one variety or another, and there was nothing resembling the tradition that I was attracted to, expressed by more mystical poets like Yeats and Blake and Whitman, and the kind of power of mysticism to empower the individual to create a kind of democratic vision, especially with people like Blake and Whitman. Yeats was a little more conservative, and so I was attracted to Yeats' poetry more than his politics. So basically, there wasn't any room for what I wanted to do. So I just decided to quit, and I went off to Canada, which was a good place to be, because Canada, with McLuhan in Toronto and Trudeau, was just coming into its own and becoming, it was no longer the kind of sleepy province of England and forgotten by America. It was beginning to be an interesting, exciting place in its own right. And Toronto remains one of my favorite cities.
Did you study with McLuhan for a time?
No, not at all.
Not at all?
I was already an associate professor when I went up to Toronto, and I had, I think I had already published At the Edge of History when I met McLuhan. And I had attended a lecture of his when he came to visit MIT, and I had, of course, always read his work in the 60s and used it in all my books. And I always liked his free intellectual style, because he seemed to be able to live an imaginative intellectual life even within academia, and so he was, in that sense, a positive role model. But I'd never studied under him. And then when I went to his coach house, I was a little distressed, because it was like a temple in which there were all disciples and followers. And they were all sort of weak Xeroxes of him, or what in genetics would be called weak clones.